So you've been talking a lot about relevance versus personalization.
Mm-hmm.
Can you maybe explain a bit more what you mean?
Yeah. So the difference between the two, and often I'm like my heart is like beating fast within this topic because it's such an important topic, and the impact of it on outreach is so big. But I 99.9% of the time see them getting mixed up in the market for which one's which. The danger of that is that you think that one thing will do something within an email, but it won't have the impact, and then you'll stop doing it. So the difference between relevance and personalization, and we can get into 3 types of relevance in a second, but the difference between relevance and personalization, a la Webster, Google defined, is relevance is going to be one-to-many, something that is in a relationship to someone one-to-many, and personalization means it's only one-to-one. So if I can send an email to you, and I can send that same email to Daniel, and that same email to Mike, then it's going to be relevance based only. But if I can only send that email to you, if I'm like you said this in this article when you said this clip, then that means it has some bit of personalization, which is one-to-one, strictly one-to-one.
Yeah. And what do you feel is the impact of relevance versus personalization? Like what would you go for in your outreach?
Yeah, so in all cases I would go for relevance, and we can get into different types of it, but in all cases I would go for relevance. In the vast majority of cases I would go for personalization, both. I think that they do different things.
Yeah.
The biggest problem that people have nowadays, whether they know it or not, is does this person read the email and actually read the email?
Yeah.
And so you have to pattern interrupt, and personalization has been very effective for me to, interrupt the normal pattern. Relevance addresses the issue of, like I say that there's only 3 things that are important in outreach. Do they read it? So that's personalization. Are you relevant once they do? And psychologically, do you take care of them along the way? So the relevance piece, even if I read it, if it's not in relationship to one of the 3 types of relevance, I'm not going to respond in a manner that that I take the meeting, essentially. So I think you can never turn relevance. You can turn personalization, but in the vast majority of cases, unless you're like B2C or is one case that you obviously can't, then I would include some clip of personalization and hook them together, to stick the landing in the end.
I think you shouldn't do outbound if you're B2C, at least not sending emails.
Well, that's an interesting topic. Why do you say that?
First things first, I think in most countries it's illegal to do outbound on personal email addresses, for example, just to sell B2C products. I think as long as it's in the B2B world, I mean in Europe I know it's illegal for sure, and in the US it depends on the states. You have the Can Spam Act type of thing, but it's much more legal on the business side rather than on the personal, on the
Interesting.
B2C side.
And why? So B2C it's illegal to do outbound, and why is that?
I think it's just a matter of where did you actually get the data. So for me the way I would define outbound mean reaching out to someone who's never reach out to you or give you their permission to reach out to them. And technically in Europe that's for sure if a consumer has not put his email addresses into a online form or agreed to be contacted or reached out, and you reach out to them, you can get a huge fine. However, if it's in B2B, you have what we call the legitimate interest, which is meaning basically that you are allowed to reach out to people as long as you offer them a way to opt out, which is exactly the same of what's happening in California with the new data privacy shield type of things that they are
Interesting. So and how they're understanding that is it a personal email address?
Yeah, exactly.
So to me, relevance only messaging is marketing. To me, relevance only is you put a relevant, some relevant message on a billboard, or you put it in some mass space where you think you'll get a lot of eyeballs, hoping that they will see that and they'll identify with it. But it's mass.
Maybe we can dig deep into the relevance definition.
Yes.
Because maybe like for me, like I would potentially get a different definition on relevance than you. So I'm curious to like get what you have in mind.
Okay, so yeah. So that the three types of relevance to me, there's only three types in my opinion. It's well, actually, I'm gonna say that there's four.
Okay.
So there's relevance to someone's metric, like stating things according to the metric that they're trying to achieve within a buyer persona.
For example, you've seen they want to reach out X revenue targets, and this would be relevant for them to. Okay.
And it's relevant in terms of buyer persona, and I think that's oddly enough the one that most people miss is they caveat everything irrespective of the person's metric. And I'm like, if they're sales enablement, they're going to be metriced on adoption. So they're going to like a central process. If I'm a VP of sales, I'm metriced on quota attainment. So all I give a crap about, is essentially like, does this help us in close one? Like, I'll give you an example and then I'll go into the other type. Sorry, but it's just too relevant apropos to the situation. But before we started filming this, I asked Daniel, one of the videographers, I said, should I put the hat on? Should I wear the hat? And I was saying more from like the aesthetic view, does it look unprofessional? Can I get away with it? But he responded in terms of his buyer persona metric. He said, no, it casts a shadow. His metric is to get high quality film and to not have a shadow and to not have glare so that it's a great video. So he responded according to his metric because his goal is that. So he's like, so the hat's a no, because it essentially doesn't help me hit my goal. But I was more talking about the aesthetic of it, like, can I get away with that in a video, etc. But it was interesting to me that like everyone's going to operate according to their metrics. So that's the first one. Second one is according to any kind of trigger that's either they've taken or has happened to them in market. Okay. So like they've downloaded content, they attended a webinar, they inbound and took a demo request, and then go ahead.
So we would say like behavior essentially, like an action that leads to a certain relevance.
Yeah, like that they took an action, or like your messaging is in relationship to an action that they took or an action that happened to them of like maybe the market downturned or during the pandemic shift, like all of a sudden issued a new problem. But the second one is triggers. The third one is going to be the problems that they typically run into as a buyer, like buyer persona in the day-to-day. So like sales, like SDRs not being able to find great data, them having a hard time with the right messaging to get a hold of people, but that's the third one. And then the fourth one is going to be what I call core static relevance of like according to their geography or where they're based, of like something that it's not a movement, it's not according to their metric, it's not according to their problems, but it's something that's statically true about them. So there's like any kind of geo, any kind of demographic that they hit, usually you're going to see more of these used within B2C and then marketing. So those are the only four that I can identify. Now underneath each one of those, of like the triggers, for instance, I have 139 triggers that they could potentially take or happens to them. But those are the four that like your wording should be in relationship to one of those four. Okay.
It's funny because like on a personal note, I would split on the behavioral aspect.
Yes.
Because for example, you mentioned like for me, I would split them into two different categories because I don't consider the same as someone taking an action, for example, going to a webinar, like downloading an ebook, etc., which I believe is like kind of internal. It was your choice to go to the webinar, your choice to download that ebook. And so I like to split behavioral into like what people are actually making or doing or like an action they're taking versus, exactly.
I do split, you're brilliant. He's so smart. So I do split them up. I just didn't go into the detail, but postbound and bridgebound. Postbound is non-hand-raising marketing action. Inbound is like they said, I want to talk to you about your product. And bridgebound, is going to be the latter category. It's broken down in 5 buckets. And one is like all the actions that happen to you, like market downturn. Anywho, keep going.
No. It was just the
why would you split that? Well, why would you split them? What do you think is the importance behind that?
I just feel like the reaction is going to be a bit different, and the intent behind is very different, because when something happened to you, you are not in control, which means that you're not going to react exactly the same if someone reach out to you.
Totally.
Because, for example, let's say like you have been identified, let's say like your restaurant, COVID hits, you have to shut down. It's already like it's a huge
Bad
pain for
situation.
you. It's a really bad situation. So when someone reach out to you with relevance, in the way that they're gonna reach out, might be, I think, for the restaurant owner, for example, feeling like more guilt, more problem. Like
Totally.
it's not gonna be in the same state as, okay, I've downloaded this, I'm like super interested in that ebook or that topic, or I attended that webinar, I want to learn more, I want to potentially like I'm like basically like all the signals are saying that I want to buy, or at least like I will buy something, not sure what yet, versus, okay, something happened to me, I'm in trouble, and I don't know if I'm actually gonna either shut down my business or potentially like find solutions. Exactly.
I agree. I couldn't say how much I agree. To me, if they attended a webinar or downloaded content, like they're more in control in that case scenario, and they are giving you a small signal of like, I do have pain. Like if I'm, if I downloaded some of your templates, then I'm showing you that I do have some sort of pain, that I am, either not hitting quota, I can't figure out why, I think it's the messaging. But in the other case scenario, it happened to you. So how I think about it is, you can sell somewhat based on pain for the content download webinar registrant, exclusively. I still would argue that if they really needed something done, they would have inbounded, hard inbound. But I pivot more towards in the bridge bound category, towards you. To your point, you have a shorter leash, so you better, if you get in front of me, you better have something that I don't know that will help me, and that's where you're going to win credibility of like, then I see this massive problem, and instead of the salesperson adding that problem by being like, hey, you're like your fly's down, like all of a sudden you have to say something about them in specific that you've noticed, so that I know like, oh, okay, this is an ally who can help me understand this new problem of like what the pandemic means to my restaurant business, kind of thing.
And whenever you were mentioning like the link and the duo between relevance and personalization, what would you say like the impact of each on the amount of meeting that you book?
Yeah, it's a great question. So well, the keys to the kingdom is if you can personalize on an actual problem that they have that they don't know about. That will always win the most meetings.
Yeah.
You do that, you're fine.
Yeah.
That you're like, hey, did you know that on your website X, Y, and Z is happening, and I think that it's likely causing this. Did you know this is happening? But if you're going to go any type of other non-problem centric personalization, like the link to me. Wait, what was the question again? Sorry.
No, I think it's like, how do you combine relevance and personalization to make the most out of it, and what impact both can have on the reply rate or the amount of meetings that you book?
Yes. So I view it as, from a system perspective, I have, inbound, which is hand raisers. They want to see the product. Postbound, which is non-hand raising marketing leads. Bridgebound, which is an action. They took an action or action happened to them. And then cold outbound, the trigger is that you put them, like essentially loaded them into a sequence.
Yeah.
To me, I use in postbound and bridgebound, it's the value of personalization is it's a pattern interrupt. If it's not problem-centric personalization, it's a pattern interrupt, and it displays that you know your buyer or you spent the time to research them. So I base this off of Bluma Zygarnik. She's known for the Zygarnik effect. She was a Lithuanian psychologist based in Berlin, and she noticed how waiters were essentially moving throughout the floor in a cafe one day, and she realized that she asked them about it, and she realized that they remembered tabs that weren't closed out more than tabs that were. So she did a test basically, and I think I've talked to you about this before, of she had two cohorts of people and made them do 20 tasks, but in group A, she let them finish all to completion. Group B, she interrupted 3 of them. She noticed that they were 15 to 17 times more likely to remember, group B. And so I think to the point of the new problem that we have in market is, how do we get people to stop and read our emails, not just scan through them and actually double down there. So I found the exact same results of basically, I can increase the response rate to 15 to 17%, which is industry average that I'm seeing is sub 1, you know, around 0.5, 0.4. So at like 30x is just to include the piece of personalization. Now, how I included that with the relevance is you can basically write out the trigger. Notice you downloaded content, comma, but more importantly, saw that you wrote this article. Notice you attended a webinar, comma, but more importantly, saw that you wrote this article.
Yeah.
Notice that it requested a demo, but didn't end up scheduling, comma, but more importantly, you know. So I basically write in the trigger, comma, but more importantly, and then from a Mad Libs infrastructure, say like, hey, put in the personalization here, and then people can measure the play overall of like, are content downloads doing me more favors, or webinar registrants, or event attendees? So I don't just go back to marketing and basically say I need more MQLs. I'm like, based on conversion, I need 500 MQL or 500 webinar registrants, 1,000 event attendees, because they're converting at this rate. But from a system perspective, that's usually how I get people to include the personalization, is like the trigger, comma, but more importantly in the personalization. Great news, you can automate all this language. What you have to drop in is this. And the second line is a question of like, you know, pardon the, I usually do a pattern interrupt, like pardon the ask, or not to be an annoying sales rep who doesn't play on words, but what are you doing to, and they have to hook it for 2 to 3 words. What are you doing to scale teams effectively? You know, like you mentioned in your article, comma, technical problem, comma, business problem that can lead to business impact as a result. So that's how I'm combining the two. Is then I stress to people, you know, they say like, hey, well, you can personalize it. Like I have this tool that will help you personalize to 50,000 people. I'm like, it's not personalization. And even if it is, it cannot be.
First name is not the personalization.
Totally. And I'm like, and it can't be, you cannot, and I've probably stepped on 30 demos of platforms that were like, we can do it. And I'm like, you cannot hook it.
Yeah.
You can't hook it. And that is a very important part to me. What are you thinking?
No, I think like everything you said makes perfect sense. To me, it's how exactly do you link personalization and relevance. I don't think like the two should be like splitted that much. I think they should be like always linked, because what we see is like everyone talks about personalization and its importance. I agree that it's important to break the pattern, and personalization for it is really like an easy way to do it. However, when I see people telling me like, they start their email by, I just saw your interview where you were saying something that you fucking hate pineapple on pizza.
Yeah.
And I'm like, yes, that's true. You know, like, thanks, you watched my interview, but how do you actually link? So this would be personalization, but how do you actually link to something relevant? And for me, I think a lot of people are missing the point. So they start personalization by saying things like, I saw you went to like that specific school, go Gators. I'm like, fuck it, you know, like it's
did you go to a school with the Gators?
Yeah, like Florida. Like, so, and again, you know, like I think, it's personalized, but it doesn't really make sense from an outbound perspective or an outreach perspective in general. So I just think that whenever you are thinking of outbound in general, the two should be linked. So it's like, how can you find something they've said, something on their website that relates to a specific action where you can have the solution to their problem?
Totally. Where you win the most rapport to me is going to be personalization according to a problem they didn't know about.
Yeah.
Second is something they said that relates to what you do. The bottleneck I've seen there is people say, well, that doesn't happen very often. I'm like, I agree with you. So how, like, meaning it's going to be dependent. The third option I push people into, if they don't have it, is you still have to hook it. So I'm like, here's the 6 buckets in descending order, you know, and I'm like, you have to make a mental short list of what's true about pizza and what's true about flip the script, and then find the overlap. Now, I have found that there's going to be buyers that this works a little better with. This jarring thing that I found is I thought non-technical buyers would, technical buyers would hate that.
Yeah.
I found the opposite.
Yeah.
They like it a little bit more, but I think to your point, it leaves you a little more open to like, this wasn't me saying like, hey, this boulder's going to come through this room. It's like, hey, go Gators. You know, how, you know, what are you doing to make sure that your reps don't end up in the mouth of a Gator by sending the wrong templates to the, you know, like on the fly.
Yeah.
But I agree with you of like, if people, I think people have a hesitance from just the mental perspective. They're like, well, what kind of problems would I look for overt indicators? And every single time a company has brought it up to me, I'm like, well, what would someone look like if they were sick? Like, if they had the problem that you solve for? There's always indicators. I'm like, for us, for instance, or I worked with a sales training company the other day. I'm like, how about companies that have IPO'd that miss their, public companies that have missed their targets? Or, any kind of companies, like, just go to the web and just say, like, plummeting, revenue numbers. And I'm like, or, you can do kind of some, like, process ones of, like, okay, you request a demo and then they didn't get back to you for like a week or 2 weeks, and it's like, okay, I think they're hemorrhaging out pipeline here. Or you can even do inputs of, like, okay, they hired 50 salespeople and they haven't hired any sales enablement or any tech, and they hyper growth really quickly. Like, there's all that. It's like, okay, I have a reason to believe that, like, Uber back in the day when it spiked up, it's like they didn't have time to train salespeople and get, like, to do anything. So it's like, what are those indicators what is the runny eyes, or sorry, runny nose, like red eyes of your clients if they have a problem? What were you gonna say?
Something that you mentioned, I think it's really interesting, like about, okay, looking at public data, especially like for IPO company missing targets. Something I would add though is the risk whenever you reach out to people when they have missed quota, etc. It's like
brilliant,
because if you start by saying, I've seen that, yeah, exactly, it looks like, okay, thank you, like delete, like, because you don't want another person telling you that you suck. And something I've seen that works actually really well is to have a team which is a mix between the marketing and the sales team that's going to reach out to specific accounts by saying that they are just interviewing specific companies. So for example, we're interviewing like the last 100 companies that have IPO'd in order to talk about, how sales is evolving when you just IPO and how quota management is handled. We've talked to, and then you name drop a few companies that just IPO'd, and I'd love to have you for like 15 minutes to ask you questions. Your company will be mentioned towards and it's just very positive about all the great initiatives that you are setting up to do X, Y, Z. By doing this, because you are like interviewing people, your reply rate is actually like much
open.
higher.
Yeah.
They are much open. And for you, it allows you to just get a lot of insights for what companies are doing or are not doing. So whenever you reach out to actually the manager or top manager or like VP, you actually already have a lot of insights from their team. And you can focus on that just simple pain point that they are not yet doing, but that that could help them solve a problem. But people are like too lazy to do this. They are not patient enough, and they don't want to work like sales and marketing, which I think is a shame because we used to do that like all the time. Like I would reach out to people, record my calls, send that to like freelancers to write like copy about it, and then write articles where you basically have people associated with other big names so they are happy. So whenever you reach out again, like you have much more.
Interesting. Yeah. Because they're like, I'm with.
Yeah, it's like a 2 steps. Yeah, exactly.
So why do you have like eyes lit up when you were talking about the lagging indicator that you can't be like, hey, saw you miss quota? Why do you think that can be a damaging thing, mentioning to someone that they have missed their lagging indicator?
I think like people don't like to be remembered that they missed or failed at something. Like it's the same like when your mom is telling you like clean your bedroom. Do you know that your room is actually like dirty? Of course you know. Do you know like it's a mess? Yeah, you are the one who did it. Like so having someone telling you about it again doesn't feel like like you just feel it's a pain in the ass. Like why would I trust that person? I don't know who they are, and the first thing they come in is to tell me what I should do. So I just feel like having a different approach and first build trust is what will lead to an actual meeting.
Totally. And I've seen a difference between mentioning someone's lagging indicator, like their overarching metric, because if you mention that, that's what they're like. Imagine in the kid example of like, number one, that your room is dirty, but imagine that like the kid's job, the whole thing is not go to school and do any of that, is just keep this room clean, and the room's still not clean. Like when you mention that to someone, like instantly, and I think there's a bit of exposing, and you're a stranger and you're walking up and saying something like that, and it's hard enough, for people to open up about that in an intimate setting, certainly to someone that you know, and certainly from a public perspective. But I'm like, I've seen a difference between mentioning that. So the plays that I run, I actually do a play that's cold outbound, meaning it doesn't mention it, but I sequence companies that have missed their target, because I'm like, I know that they've missed their target, but I'm gonna be French and not mention, not mention it, and just be the right person at the right time. But I've noticed there's a difference between that and if you call out a root cause, meaning if you're like, hey, this process is broken, then they're much more receptive. They're way more receptive too if you give them an industry stat of like,
did you unique insights,
totally, of like, you're like, hey, so you're and asking them to cross compare themselves so that you're not making them come out of the fold. And honestly, in relation to other companies that are also running into that problem, and also like that they know, like, okay, yeah, I made a 60 on this test, but they're gonna like instill some kind of curve, because everyone, like, the highest grade was a 65 or something. But the best one that I've seen is, especially if they weren't fully responsible for the thing, but it actually impacts them. So a great example is if I reach out to sales development leaders about the demo request line, it taking 3 weeks for someone to reach out, they're like, that's marketing's job. So they're all of a sudden like, let's talk about this problem, and you have credibility because it wasn't them. And like sales leader, the same thing. When they find out that like one of their buddies will ping them and say like, hey, I got this email, from one of your sales development reps, and all of a sudden they're on the horn with, I've seen it over and over and over and over and over again, of like with their entire team, like they have an all hands, because one person got this message, and so they're like, we need to have better messaging and da-da-da. And the reason that they have the gall to do that is because they're not the one that's responsible for running that team, so it's not their fault. So I'm like, if you can live and breathe in there of like, worst case scenario, root cause, because if you give them that, like, even if you say like, I noticed you missed your business goal, it's like they're like, okay, but I don't know why I missed it. So just reminding me, to your point, that like I'm a C player doesn't help me become an A player. What does is identifying something that I can change about it to help me get there.
Definitely.
This was the most fun that I've had in a long time. This was Per Diem on personalization, the 3 types of relevance, and what's the difference between all of them. You are joining me and G for Per Diem episode 8? Hey. I'm going to guess 8.
Second hand.
8. Somewhere on the second hand. Thanks for tuning in.